Fabulous. Take it away, Chad.
Well, hello and welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here this evening. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to hear about the most haunted locations of Illinois from the safety of wherever you're watching this program from. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. All of you should be able to see the most haunted locations of Illinois. As you heard, my name is Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, I've spent the last 30 years traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampire legends in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness monster, reports of crop circles, UFOs, alien abductions, really weird people. Yeah, well, some strange places, you name it. If it's just odd and unusual, I've traveled the globe in search of these bizarre histories, folklore, and legends. But what I discovered on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore tonight. For the next 45 minutes or so, you can sit back and relax. I'll provide you with everything you need to know: the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about my research at these places. Heck, I'll even provide you the directions to get to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you to travel to these places on your own and come to your own conclusion as to whether or not you believe these legends are true. So, with that, let's explore some of the scariest places Illinois has to offer. First stop: when people think of haunted places, they often tend to think of a graveyard. Reason being is quite simple. Once cemeteries were chosen, it was thought that they would serve as a portal between our world and the spirit world. So when your loved one passed on, it would just be easier for them to travel from our world to whatever world you believe they go to. But regardless of whether or not you believe this theory, there are many places in this state where it seems to be working in reverse. The living are not moving to the dead are coming into our world. First stop: Centralia, Elmwood Cemetery. At first glance, this is your typical suburban cemetery. That is until you get to this statue of a young girl by the name of Annie. When she was alive, it was said she was loved playing the violin. She was a great violin player, and when she passed at a young age, her wealthy family constructed this monument to her with her violin. They were so heartbroken over losing her that they moved out of the area. Now it is said that when you go to this cemetery, you will see what appears to be movement of the statue. If you're quiet and you brace yourself, you might even hear the phantom sounds of a violin being played. When we went there, we brought a ton of recording equipment with us, hoping to capture these phantom disembodied violin music being played. Others claim that the statue will move right before your eyes, as though Annie is still trying to play her violin, even from the grave. Or you can head to one of the most infamous cemeteries in Illinois. Right outside a hillside is Mount Carmel Cemetery, world famous for being the final resting place of that little known gangster called Al Capone. And even though Scarface is buried there, most people go there to see this grave site. She's known as the Italian Bride. Name was Julia. And while she was giving birth, she died in the birthing process. As was the Italian custom of that time, she was to be buried in her wedding gown, hence the statue of her in her wedding gown. Here's a photo of her in the wedding gown. That's not the scary part. The scary part comes in the fact that as soon as she died, her mother began having bizarre dreams in which her daughter came to her and said, "Mom, I'm alive. Save me. Dig me up. Don't leave me here." So her mother did what any loving mother would do: petition the church and the graveyard to get permission to dig up her daughter. And her plan worked, except the only problem was it took her nearly 7 years to get this permission. But they still dug up her daughter, and they were amazed to find that even though the casket was rotting away, the young woman looked like she was buried the day before. In fact, it was so creepy, they said, "Hey, let's take a photo of that and put that on the gravestone as well," which they did. You can see after 7 years in the ground, she looked like she was merely sleeping. Word started to spread about her condition. Then people started seeing the ghostly image of a woman dressed in a bridal gown walking through the cemetery. At first glance, they thought maybe she was someone getting married and paying her respects to her loved ones on her big day, only to find that she was nearly transparent or would disappear right before their eyes into thin air. And it's a great piece of legend, great urban legend, but was anyone ever buried alive? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts from that era. Back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, they would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem silly for us to fear today with modern science and medicine, but our grandparents were so afraid they came up with several inventions to stop this. My favorite is this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like it would do. It was a bell you could have above your grave with a rope on a pole into your casket. So if you awoke in time, all you'd have to do is tug that rope, it would ring the bell and alert the caretaker who lived at the cemetery that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. There was one problem with this invention, though. On many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare, thinking everyone had been buried alive. In fact, in the old days, when your loved one passed, it was your responsibility to sit around the graveyard, making sure that they were truly dead for a couple nights. And as evidenced by the photo you see here, in the old days, graveyards were more multifunctional than they are today. You'd have family reunions there. You'd have picnics there. Kids would play. You could camp and sleep in the graveyard. Where today, most of our graveyards are just memorials for our deceased and nothing else. 1918. Illinois has a long history of circus performances in the state. And in fact, in 1918, the Hagenbeck Wallace shows were passing through Indiana when all of a sudden they came and a deadly crash. They pulled over at night to sleep. Another train did not realize they were there, crashed into them. But it wasn't the crash that did most of them in. It was because they were in wooden cars lit with kerosene, the lanterns. Huge fire killing many, many people. 86 people died, over 127 injured, plus all the animals. The bodies were then brought to Illinois, to the Forest Home Cemetery, better known as Showman's Rest. And this is where they were all laid to rest. Now, the interesting part is that most of these people, their real names weren't even known. You might be Madison Mike or West Side Willie, they would call you. which is why you have graves of the unknown male or Baldy there. But that's not the scary part. The scary part comes in the fact that people still believe the circus is performing even from the grave. They'll hear the sounds of elephants moving through, they'll feel the ground vibrating, they'll feel other animals moving about, they'll even see circus performers or hear circus music. Many skeptics claim that what they're actually hearing are the sounds of animals at the nearby Brookfield Zoo, although most of the animals they hear out at Forest Home Cemetery, they do not have at the zoo. For many people, the old adage rings true that the show must go on, even when the performers have perished so many years ago. Or what about the Middle Creek Cemetery in Byron, Illinois? Here you have this amazing old mausoleum cut into the landscape. As soon as the former senator was buried there, people began congregating there, mostly teenagers and college age kids, and they thought it was haunted. They'd go out there and party, they'd hear voices, they'd see disembodied lights moving about. Eventually, it was thought that they could hear people talking inside the mausoleum. The family of the senator were so afraid that somebody was going to break in and desecrate the body that they moved the body and had it reburied inside the cemetery proper. But that didn't stop the haunted stories of the mausoleum. People started telling about the dare. And the dare was that if you were brave enough or foolish enough to knock on the door of the locked mausoleum, you will hear knocking coming back from the inside from whoever or whatever is in there. Now, as you can see, it's heavily bolted and locked. People haven't gone in there. Luckily, I was able to get permission. I went inside, and as you can see, the place is completely empty, or at least no one living is there. Maybe someone's haunting it, but I'll leave it up to you to go there on your own. Perhaps my favorite cemetery in the state is the old Ramsey Cemetery in Effingham. And I love this story because not only do you get a haunting, you get a little bonus as well. And you'll see what I mean. So, for decades, people have talked about mysterious balls of light similar to these floating through the area, changing in size, shape, and color. Years ago, there was an old chapel there where you could go and have your funeral or pay your respects. But then a few years back, a man went out there with a weapon and ended his own life. And now the story changed to the fact that if you went to the mausoleum or the old chapel, that you would see blood oozing from the walls of the chapel. The county thought it was such a nuisance that they tore down the chapel, which only sparked more haunted stories of what are they hiding? Why are they trying to keep us out? And as people ventured out there, in order to get there, you have to go down some gravel old dirt roads. And along those dirt roads are a series of tunnels and caves that are indented into the landscape. When all of a sudden, unsuspecting motorists find themselves staring at something in the caves, something that couldn't be there, something that shouldn't be there. Yet there it is, staring right back at them. What are these witnesses seeing? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. This creature, for a lack of a better term, they called it a werewolf, the size of a bear, but shaped more like a wolf with the long muzzle and the deep, dark, matted down fur, the claws, the fangs. Sometimes it's loping about on all fours. Other times it's a biped running upright on its hind legs. But you don't have to feel bad. You're not the only people to believe in werewolves. In fact, thanks to my good friend and colleague, the late Linda Godfrey, my home state of Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began when Linda was working as a journalist in southeastern Wisconsin, Elkhorn. She started receiving reports of people traveling down a small stretch of road called Bray Road. There, usually at night, but not always, people would see, again, very similar to the Ramsey Cemetery creature, a werewolf, often on the side of the road. Sometimes it was eating freshly killed roadkill or game prey that it had captured. Once Linda's books came out, I started receiving reports of these creatures from all over the US. But here's the good news is that outside of charging at a couple of vehicles, these things seem to be just as afraid of witnesses as witnesses are of them. And rather than attack and try to devour people, they seem more likely to just scurry back into the underbrush and try to remain undetected. So that's good news for you that if you go looking for these things, whether in Effingham or at Bray Road, most likely you're not going to die. Well, 50-50, but still pretty good odds when you're out werewolf hunting. I love this story of Bartlett because this story is so bizarre and so weird that they could have taken the legend of Munger Road and made it into a B horror drive-in movie type flick that you would see, which is exactly what they did do. They turned it into a Hollywood B horror movie. And the Munger Road has so many variations to it. But the main story tells that many years ago, a family was coming home, car or van full of children, when their car stalled out on the train tracks. And while the mother was trying to operate the car, a train came rumbling by, smashed into them, killing them. The train went off the track, smashed into a house, killing all of the people in the house as well. And now the legend tells that if you park your car on the side of the tracks and put it in neutral, your car will be pushed uphill over the tracks by the spirits of those children who met their fateful end there. It is said that they are trying to prevent you from suffering the same fate that they suffered. Many people will sprinkle baby powder, flour on the back of their vehicle. And once they're pushed to safety, they claim to find little handprints or fingerprints as evidence that they were pushed by the spirits of those children. Others claim that the place is haunted by the phantom train. They'll be out there exploring when all of a sudden they'll see the light of the train coming. They'll feel the vibration. They'll hear the rumbling of the engine, but the train never arrives. It's the ghost train that was responsible for the death of that family so many years ago. Now, interestingly, that when this legend started decades and decades ago, this was a rarely used road. But today, it's filled with heavy traffic. So if you're going to take this dare, be very, very careful. I would hate to have to add you to my next program as another casualty of Munger Road. Sometimes folklore is not stagnant. It seems to be always morphing and progressing, which is evidenced by our next case, perhaps the most infamous case in Illinois. It started at the old Willowbrook Ballroom outside of Justice, Illinois. Back in the 1930s, it was said there was a dance going on. And after the dance, a young girl by the name of Mary left to go home. On her way home, she was involved in an accident and died. Whether she was struck by an automobile or in a car crash, we don't know. But ever since that fateful evening, many people have seen the ghost of Mary on the side of the road, wearing an old flapper-like ball gown from the 1930s. At first glance, people think maybe she broke down or needs some assistance. But when they slow down, she's nearly transparent or vanishes right into thin air. Now, what's interesting is that the legend of the vanishing hitchhiker is one of the most ubiquitous legends in America. But what sets this story apart from those is that people claim they've actually picked her up. Since the 1930s, dozens of people claim to have given her a ride. And they'll be driving with her, and when all of a sudden she'll vanish into thin air, or when they pass by Resurrection Cemetery, all of a sudden her spirit will be in front of the gates walking into the cemetery, hence the name Resurrection Mary. One man even claimed to see her walk through the locked gates, and then they discovered these burn marks in the gate as though she had walked through and left her imprint behind. The gate obviously has been fixed, but even though these stories date back to at least the 1930s, no one is quite sure who Resurrection Mary may have been. There are many theories, but what we do know is she would have had to have died around 1930 because that's when the legends originated. And we believe her name was Mary or some variation of Mary. But who she might be, why she might be there, that's up to you to determine for yourself. But here's the interesting twist. A couple years ago, the Willowbrook Ballroom burned to the ground. They decided not to rebuild it as a ballroom, which then begs the question, what's going to happen to Resurrection Mary? Are people still going to see her on Archer Avenue? Or will she simply vanish and the legend will slowly be forgotten? And that's an important folklore question of what happens to that haunted forest when it becomes a Target parking lot? Do the legends remain or do they shift somewhere else? For that, we simply do not know. Some of you of a certain age might remember this book series, the Choose Your Own Adventures, where you literally got to pick how you thought the book should progress. And if you're a fan of that kind of story, the next case is going to be right up your alley because this is a place called Crybaby Bridge in Monmouth. Version 1. Years ago, a distraught mother went crazy, brought her children down to the river where she took their lives in a watery grave. And when the children were disposed of, she joined them in death as well. But if that's too macabre for you, turn to page 85. You'll hear the story of a school bus driving over the bridge way too fast where they lost control, crashed into the dark, turning cold waters of the river below. And before the emergency services could show up, the bus had turned into an underwater coffin. If that's not your cup of tea, turn to page 150 and you'll hear the story of a drunk old farmer leaving the bar one night, driving too fast across the bridge, not realizing there was a group of kids fishing there, smashed into all of them, killing them all, and then never being apprehended. Regardless of what version you pick on your storyline, you will end up at Crybaby Bridge. And it's here weird things are said to happen. People have all sorts of mechanical issues with their vehicles. Brand new cars won't work. Batteries die out. People have to be jumped or towed out of the area. It is said that if you put your keys on top of your hood or your roof, that your car will not start up again if you turn it off. And those who sit out there will hear the faint cries of an infant crying, hence the term Crybaby Bridge. At first, it sounds like these things are coming from the water below, and they might be, but the longer people sit out there, these sounds get closer and closer till it sounds like they're coming from right under your vehicle. Infants crying where they met their watery end so many years ago. Even if you don't believe in ghosts or crybaby spirits, I can tell you sitting out there by yourself at midnight, every little splash in the water is going to have your mind conjuring up images of those water ghosts, those babies in the water, and you'll probably hop back into your vehicle pretty quickly. Now, with Halloween fast approaching, many people love to get into the spirit of the season. And for some, that entails going to all the haunted hay rides, the corn mazes, the haunted houses where people will jump out at you and try to scare you, get you into the mood for the Halloween season. And those are great. Those are fun. But I have a recommendation for you. If you like that kind of adventure, head to Mount Carroll, Illinois, to a place called Raven's Grin Inn, because this is a haunted house. What I mean by that is that the owners operate it as a haunted house where people will jump out at you and there'll be jump scares and mannequins that move and the like. But the house itself is thought to be haunted. In fact, it was said that during Prohibition, this house was used as a speakeasy and brothel, an illegal place to go and drink, dance, and gamble the night away. And that is thought to have led to it being haunted. Many guests will come in and they'll go into the basement where the old speakeasy was, and they'll see what appears to be a woman dressed like a flapper girl from Prohibition era, thinking maybe she's a tour guide dressed up in period costume. They'll watch her only to see her vanish right into a wall. Others will see weird lights moving about and then disappearing right into thin air. They're so impressed by the light display, they've asked the owners what technology they have that is better than Disneyland. And the owners have to tell them that they have no technology other than otherworldly guests that are also in the house. You might want to get there before Halloween, check it out, and you'll have a wonderful time. And you might get a little spooked by the hired actors or the undead people inside as well. What I found fascinating is that Illinois is chock full of witch stories. Dozens of places around Illinois are thought to be cursed by old witch legends. And these legends aren't the ones you find in Hollywood, because in Hollywood, every witch is a supermodel running around, not very scary at all. But the witch stories in Illinois are more tragic, like the one of Chesterville Cemetery. Except the locals, they don't call it Chesterville Cemetery. They call it Witch Cemetery. Legend is, many years ago, a young girl was practicing witchcraft, the dark arts. So the community, in order to stop her from bringing evil to their village, took her life and buried her out in the cemetery. And they planted a tree over her grave. A lot of people mistakenly think that trees were put over graves to serve as a marker. And in some instances they were, but the folklore idea of a tree over the grave was literally meant to keep the spirit grounded, that as long as the tree was there, the spirit could not come back from the dead. And not only did they take that precaution, they put an iron gate around this woman's grave. Now, her name has been lost to history, if it was ever known at all. But they put the iron gate around her gravesite, not to keep us out or scavengers out, to keep the spirit in. The belief in folklore is that ghosts cannot pass through iron. So if you had wronged somebody in life and you were afraid of them coming back from the grave to haunt you, you'd put an iron bar on their casket, or you'd put an iron gate around their grave so they could not come back and haunt you. Now the legend tells that if you go there and touch the tree at night, it will release the spirit of the witch, and she will chase you out of the cemetery. It is said that if anything happens to this tree, whether it's blown down, cut down, or dies from a disease, it will release the vengeful witch, and she'll come back looking for revenge on the townsfolk. But she's not the only witch. If you go to Ashmore, you'll come to St. Omar Cemetery out in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Here, many believe there's a witch that murdered her husband and their children out there. People have seen her walking about. Others have gone out and heard people talking to them, disembodied voices, but when they look around, nothing but forest and farmland. But it's here people believe they have proof that this woman, this witch named Caroline, was indeed a deadly witch. And that proof comes in the form of something you can see to this very day. And it involves the old gravestone of Caroline. The reason people believe she was a witch is because the date of her death, which you can see here, is listed as February 31st, 1882. Now, it is very difficult to die on February 31st, even on a leap year. Some say it was an engraving error, too expensive. Don't fix it, doesn't matter anyway. Others point to the folklore of witches, stating that they can only come back on the anniversary of their death to haunt you. So if this was a suspected witch like this woman, you'd put their date of death as February 31st, therefore, thereby making it so they could never come back and get you. But if it is the reason they did it, it doesn't seem to be working because so many people have seen the witch that it doesn't seem to have any effect. Great place, a nice little oddity if you're looking to explore the weird side of Illinois. And speaking of the weird side, if you thought these stories were bizarre, and they were, these next few stories are going to be completely bizarre, including in Collinsville, the Gates of Hell, a series of 7 tunnels, most of which are under railroad crossings, where it is said that if you start going through a couple of these on one night, weird things will begin to happen. You might start feeling very warm. You might hear your name being called out. You might see dark apparitions moving about. If you pass through 4 or 5 of them, you might encounter the phantom hellhounds that are thought to protect these portals, these guardians. These hellhounds, if you're not familiar, are large black dogs with glowing red or green eyes. They've been reported throughout history in many cultures around the planet. Many believe they do the devil's bidding and that they are a harbinger of ill fate, that if you see one, the Grim Reaper will be coming for you very shortly. But if you do see it, don't turn around. Keep going, because it is said that if you pass through all 7 of these gates in one night, especially if you can be at the 7th one at midnight, not only will you see these hellhounds, but you'll discover why they're there. Because it is said that you will see a portal to hell that will open up and try to swallow you in. Witnesses claim that they could feel an intense heat rise up. They could see the flames coming toward them. Unfortunately, most of them didn't stick around long enough to find out if this truly was a portal to hell. And those who did, obviously, they're in hell, so they can't tell us about it. But most of the witnesses I've spoken with, they felt a little shy and embarrassed about reporting this because they knew how it sounded. A portal to hell in Illinois? But what they didn't realize is that over the last 30 years, I've collected nearly half a dozen places across your state where there's a similar story of a portal to hell opening up and swallowing you in. In fact, I've collected so many of these stories, I'm just waiting for that national headline to come out, Illinois portal to hell. But if you'd rather not, thank you, if you'd rather not look into the underworld, I suggest this time of year to grab a scary book or a movie. And for a lot of people, they love Rosemary's Baby. But many have no idea that you have your own version of it right there in Illinois at the university campus, the old Jane Addams Hull House. Now, if you forgot your history of Jane Addams was a caretaker of the less fortunate, spent her life helping out those with less means than she had. She was especially fond of disadvantaged children. And that's important for our story because it was said in the early 1900s, a young woman and her husband became pregnant. She was very religious. Her husband was an atheist. So one day she put up the Virgin Mary in her house. When her husband came home, he went irate, threw the Virgin Mary on the ground, and said he'd rather have the devil as his child than to have this stuff in his house. Seems a bit of an overreaction to me, but that's the legend. Fast forward a couple months to his wife giving birth, and you probably know where the story's going because she didn't give birth to a healthy average child. As per her husband's request, she gave birth to a devil child. It was said to have red, scaly skin, that it could walk and talk from the moment it was born. It had horns and hooves, and that it loved to do two things: swear at you and smoke cigars. Now, as crazy as this sounds, the family had no idea what to do with this devil baby. So they said, hey, Jane Addams loves children. Let's drop it off at her house. And the legend tells that Jane Addams brought it in, raised it up on the second floor as one of her own children. Believe it or not, during those days, van loads of people would show up at all times of the day and night, knocking on the door, looking to see the devil child, willing to pay money to see the devil child with Jane Addams. She had to insist that there was no devil child there. But you don't need to beg to go in. The place is open for you to tour if you like. You can go see if there's a devil child on the second floor. In fact, many of the haunted tours around the Chicagoland area will stop by there, whether they're walking or a van, and they think they see weird things up on the second floor, from apparitions to that devil child walking about as well. If there are any parents in the audience, fair warning, you're not going to like this next case. In fact, if you're not a parent, you're not going to like this next case. And this is the last big story I'm going to share with you. And I put it last as a caution for you because this story is a bit graphic, it's a bit gruesome, and it's a bit gory. So that at any time during the rest of this program, if you think to yourself, nope, this isn't really my cup of tea, feel free, log off, go throw on a Hallmark Christmas movie, cleanse your palate. I will not be offended. Those of you willing to stick around, let's travel to Cambridge, Illinois, to a place called Death Curve. For decades, people have talked about this bend in the road being cursed, that if you drive down the road, out of nowhere, you will see the ghostly spirit of an axe-wielding woman covered in blood who will chase you off the road. You will crash your car and die, hence the term Death Curve. The stories have been going for numerous decades, but the origin was always a little bit fuzzy. Well, it turns out that a family did live out on that farm in the 1800s, early 1900s. They were the Markham family. And in the early 1900s, Julia Markham, the mother, went crazy. She snapped. She went psychotic. She told her two oldest and strongest children to go fetch wood and water for the day. When they were gone, one by one, she invited her 5 youngest children into the house where she used an axe to dispose of them. When the 2 older children came back, they were treated to the same behavior. In a matter of moments, she had killed all 7 of her children. I told you this was going to be nasty. Then she tried to slit her own throat. When that didn't work, she gathered what she could of the children's bodies, poured coal oil all over them and herself, and lit their house on fire. This is not their house. Neighbors caught wind of the fire, literally raced over just in time to see Mrs. Markham coming out of the house looking like a charred Freddy Krueger. They also saw the remains of the children in the house. And before she perished on the front lawn, she admitted to killing all of her children. Since that fateful day, many believe the place has been haunted or cursed. Strange balls of light can be seen on this old fence line. I talked to people who remembered back in the 80s going there as high school students and seeing these weird lights moving about. Every time I've gone there, I brought my hatchet with me, hoping to entice the spirit of the ghost, although hopefully not to kill me. Others claim that when you walk onto the land, you will see the Markham farmhouse appear. Again, this is not it. And it is said that if you walk into the house, you will never walk out again. Much is the same with Bachelor's Grove Cemetery in Midlothian. Right down the road from where the Markham children died is the county cemetery. Many believe it is haunted. They'll be passing by there late at night. They'll see children playing, wonder why they're there at such a late hour, or why they're not properly dressed for the Illinois winters. And then they'll vanish. Others will be in the cemetery paying their respects to their loved ones when they'll hear and see children laughing, playing, giggling. But when they look around, nothing but farmland and gravestones. Many believe it's the ghost of the Markham children because right in the middle of the screen here is where the unmarked grave is, where their bodies were dumped, their charred remains. Right next to them, what was left of their mother was dumped next to them as well. Many believe it's the Markham children still haunting the place where they met their horrific end so many years ago. But as I'm running low on time tonight, here's what I hope you take from the program: that the overwhelming majority of people who contact me about a haunted place, it's about their own house. Many believe they know who's haunting it. They smell grandma's perfume or on the anniversary of her death or notice a loved one. Some have no idea who or what is haunting it. Believe it or not, many are okay with it. It doesn't bother them. They become accustomed to it. Others would rather, as you can imagine, get out of there as fast as they can. And they all report similar things: mysterious rapping and knockings on the doors and windows, electrical disturbances, strange smells, apparitions, odd noises, objects moving on their own, things disappearing and reappearing months later in the most obvious of places, and on and on and on. But the reason I'd like to have this as the very last story is because that I hope this one sticks with you. Because later this evening, when all of you put your head down on your pillows and you hear the wind rustling outside your window, I want you to ask yourself, is it possible, just maybe, that that wasn't the wind howling outside there? And maybe you too are living in a haunted place. So with that, if you want more information, my website, Chad Lewis Research, has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here tonight at the program. Grab one of my books. Go on your own adventure of your state. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird place. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some weird people. And along the way, you might just discover that the strangest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll open it up. If you have any questions, comments, or stories from me, you can either throw them in the chat room or unmute yourself if you like. Otherwise, you let me off the hook very easy for this program. And keep in mind, this is just the tip of the iceberg for paranormal locations. You can't throw a rock in Illinois without hitting a place that has a supernatural reputation. And especially as we approach Halloween, when that veil between worlds becomes its thinnest, this might be the perfect opportunity for you to check out what's on the other side, or maybe for the other side to check out on you. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat or just unmute yourself. Um, yeah, otherwise, again, you're letting me off the hook way too easy tonight.
I am going to stop recording and then we can continue the conversation.